Hello, everyone. Can you hear me? Hello? Hello? Hello, everyone. Welcome to BIOMES. My name is Jeffrey Blay. I'm a second year YSE from Professor Sito's lab and then a member of the BIOMES committee. For this week's BIOMES, our guest speaker is from the African Development Bank. But before I introduce her, I'll briefly touch on the purpose of BIOMES as a seminar series and then our goal as a committee. So the BIOMES is a YSE flagship seminar series featuring community-sourced interdisciplinary presentations on research, policy, and activism surrounding pressing environmental issues. And our goal as a committee is to inspire and inform conversations within the YSE community. And some quick announcement before I introduce our guest speaker. Those that are joining us from Zoom, you can post your contributions and your questions in the Q&A session, and then they will be addressed. So our guest speaker for today is a senior climate finance officer at the African Development Bank. She is the coordinator of the Africa Climate Change Fund, a multi-donor trust fund hosted by the African Development Bank to improve the resilience of African countries to the negative impact of climate change and the transition to a low-carbon development. She manages 26 small grant projects that are strengthening the technical capacities of more than 27 African countries to assess international climate finance and implement small-scale adaptation projects to enhance their resilience. Prior to joining the African Development Bank, she worked as a program officer with the UNDP Ghana, developing and implementing projects and initiatives on integrating environmentally sustainable production practices into cocoa production, South-South cooperation and renewable energy technology transfers between Ghana and China, and also worked on the implementation of Ghana's nationally determined contributions. She also worked with the Energy and Resource Institute in East Africa as the Africa Program Coordinator when she managed projects promoting the adoption of off-grid renewable energy technology using market mechanisms to establish renewable energy enterprises in rural communities in Ethiopia, Kenya, and Malawi. She holds an MESc in Forest Finance from the distinguished Yale School of the Environment and a BSc in Natural Resource Management from Kwame Nkrumah University of Science and Technology in Ghana. Fellow YSEs, I humbly introduce to you Rita Effah.
All right, I hope you can hear me. And good afternoon, everybody, and thank you for being here. It's surreal to be here. It's about 10 years since I left what we used to call FES and now YSE. And it's good to see the new crop of students. And these are sacred halls, I call it, because I think you come in here as one person and you leave here a little bit transformed. And today, I'm really happy to share a little bit about the work we are doing in Africa. And I think in such a room with diverse ideas, diverse backgrounds, it helps to also have balanced viewpoints from time to time. And I thank the BIOMES committee for inviting me. We started this discussion back in July, and it's a pleasure to really be here and share my work with you. So very quickly, I'm going to focus on finance and climate action in Africa. And let me tell you, this is a really big topic, and we cannot do it justice in 40 minutes. But I'm going to try to be very specific and leave room for us to have a discussion afterwards. So I'm going to start with the context. It's important that you understand, if you're not already aware of it, you understand a little bit the African context when it comes to development and climate change. And then I will go into our work as the African Development Bank. I'm sure a lot of you do not know what the African Development Bank is, so I use the opportunity to share a little bit more. And then I will focus on climate finance in Africa, what the global perspectives are and how it touches on Africa, and also share a bit some project examples from the trust fund that I manage, which is a climate fund called the Africa Climate Change Fund. And then that will be basically the bulk of my presentation, and I'll turn it over for some questions. Right. Okay. All right. So what is the context for Africa? Africa contributes less than 4% of global greenhouse gas emissions, but it receives only 3% of global finance. And then from the impacts of climate change that we're realizing, it's estimated by the African Development Bank that Africa loses up to 15% of its GDP due to these impacts. What we know from the IPCC most recent Fifth Assessment Report is that global temperatures, which are currently around 1.1 degrees Celsius, 2 degrees Fahrenheit equivalent, impacts with this temperature rise, we're already experiencing the impact, and they are going to be logged in for some time to come. On the Africa front, we are already experiencing, or communities are already feeling the impacts of climate change. I already said this. We know that with the impact, we will have to adapt. Adaptation for African countries is not an option. We really need it. We need to adapt. What we also know is that when you look at this climate change vulnerability index map, 10 out of 12 most vulnerable countries are in Africa. And with these countries that already have underlying issues of instability, this further exacerbates it. Climate change further exacerbates it. So I wanted to share these with you. Some of them go a little bit way back and some are more recent. We are already seeing impacts in the form of floods, droughts. We are seeing impacts in the form of cyclones. We are seeing impacts in the form of really high heat temperatures. And so these examples are really just to show you what is happening out there. And then also more recent examples from the Eastern Africa, which has for almost a decade now, almost every year you have incidences of droughts, really prolonged droughts that impacts on livestock, on agriculture, which are really fundamental to livelihoods, large groups of people and their livelihoods, excuse me. In Ghana, we also are experiencing coastal erosions in some parts of the country where the town borders coast. We are more recently, 2022, actually a month ago or so, there's been flooding in Nigeria, in several parts of Nigeria, which has led to incidences of people losing their lives. We have the 2022 wildfires in Morocco. And I mean, in your own context, you already know that climate change is impacting you. You have the California wildfires. In some developed countries, you see wildfires, I think in Australia, in New Zealand, we've seen these. And there are also other examples of droughts, of flooding, tropical storms, which are happening much more rapidly. So this African context, I hope, is relatable to your own. So this is a discussion that we have, I mean, my institution has, that we have a really big shortfall in terms of infrastructure gap. We could choose to be victims of climate change, or we could choose to see them as opportunities for development. Opportunities for development in the sense that we have a huge infrastructure gap, and that we could use addressing impacts of climate change as an opportunity to shorten this infrastructure gap that we have. So you see that here there are opportunities in energy, rather than exploiting traditional sources of energy like fossil, etc. We could look to renewable energy as alternatives to really scaling up access to energy in Africa. We could further industrialize agriculture, which is a big thing, add value to agriculture that we are doing as a continent. In the forestry land use sector, we could do more in terms of reforestation, etc. In industry, of course, you need energy to power your industries, energy to power your transport. And so all of this could be seen as an opportunity to addressing climate change impacts, should be seen as an opportunity in Africa to addressing development shortfalls. So what is climate finance? In short, climate finance is local, national, or transnational funding from public, private, and alternative sources that seeks to support climate change mitigation and adaptation. This is a definition from the UNFCCC. When you put it in the whole discussion about climate change and the global discourse on climate change and the Paris Agreement, Article 9 says that developed countries shall provide financial resources to assist developing countries with respect to both climate change mitigation and adaptation. And this is a simple but complex thing to do because countries have to put money in. It's estimated that we need about $100 billion a year. However, that money, as I'll show you later, comes in different forms and shape. And I will say, we all have our ends of the bargain to keep, and we are not there yet in terms of mobilizing that 100 billion a year that is required. Typically, the sources of climate finance really broadly can be categorized as public, private, national, international. You have bilateral funds, you have multilateral funds, you have funds that come from concessional loans, which are really low cost market rate loans that come from multilateral development banks to finance large-scale infrastructure projects. So typically, that's one big source of finance for we consider as climate finance. You have the Green Climate Fund, the Global Environment Facility, which also has other special funds under it. You have the Adaptation Fund, the Climate Investment Fund. You also have the UNF Red Plus program that has some funding also attached. You have bilateral funds. And these are deployed either as concessional loans, as green bonds, as grants, as equity, as guarantees, and they are given out in different ways and forms. And so sometimes that can also be a bit difficult to track as to whether we are really mobilizing more climate finance. So what is Africa's need when it comes to climate finance? It's estimated by the Climate Policy Initiative that I think has the most recent information when you're in case even for you as student, you're looking for some data on climate finance. They have some very recent publications on that. And this is from their report on Africa, where they say that it will, just looking at countries' nationally determined contributions, which simply put are their action plans that they've submitted to the UNFCCC. When you cost them, we will need about $2.8 trillion. Sounds like a lot of money between 2020 and 2030 to implement Africa's climate change needs, both mitigation and adaptation. And then annually, it will cost about 277 billion, based simply on countries' NDCs. And mind you, there are 54 African countries. This analysis was only done on 51 that had submitted their NDCs. So out of this 277 billion, they estimated that from countries' own domestic sources of funding, they'll be able to pull in about 26.4 billion, which is about 10% of what is required annually. And then the remaining sources will come from largely from international, public, private, and domestic, other domestic sources other than government. And of this, so far, from the analysis also between 2019 and 2020, of the 277 billion that's required annually, it's only about 12 to 15% that actually is being received. The pictures you see throughout are examples from African development banks, either finance projects or co-finance projects. So here, still from the CPI report, you see, you see that, okay. So you see that in all, there is about 20 8 billion or so, a little more than that, that has been mobilized between 2019 and 2020. And of that, the various institutions that are involved are governments accounting for about 6.4. Actually, the largest is from multilateral development finance institutions. So you have the World Bank, the African Development Bank, the Islamic Development Bank, and other multilateral development banks. Then you have multilateral climate funds, so the GCF, the GEF, the Adaptation Fund, accounting for about 1% of that. So you have from the MDBs providing the most to government to bilateral funds. So you have, as a bilateral, for example, could be JICA, the Japanese agency, or USAID. And so other bilateral, so GIZ, they will fall in here. Then you have other sources. So from the private sector, we are getting very little in that, and I will explain a little bit in that. So these are the instruments that are available. And then looking at this, it's quite interesting to see that a large part of it is going towards grants. So probably reimbursed, sometimes they are reimbursable grants, or they are just pure grants, you don't have to pay for it, so they are not loans. And then the next part, the next under that is low-cost project debt. So this could be concessional loans, sometimes equity guarantees, etc. Yeah, so these could also be from commercial banks because these are being debts at market rate, etc. So this is the most recent data we have. So about $28 billion between 2019 supporting climate finance in Africa. Then the key sectors that are covered are energy, others or cross-sector. This could touch on, I'm not very sure the details of that, but it could be financial institutions that are receiving loans to on-lend to other commercial banks or even to businesses in their countries. You have water, building and infrastructure. But it's important to note that suddenly there's been a shift in terms of increase in investment in renewable energy on the continent more broadly. And so it's interesting to see from this data that at least a large part of the financing that is getting to the African continent is going towards renewable energy largely, and also battery storage and other technologies that are needed. So what is the African Development Bank? And there are a few slides of this just to orient you. It's a regional multilateral development finance institution that was established by African countries. It's hosted in Abidjan, Côte d'Ivoire, where I'm based. That's where its headquarters is, but it works across the continent, across all 54 countries, and it has country offices in several countries across the continent. The bank we call ourselves an infrastructure bank. It finances projects, programs, studies in the areas of agriculture, energy, utility, education, water, sanitation. Private sector are sometimes also supporting a lot financial to build the capacity of African financial institutions, commercial banks, providing funding to them to on-lend, and also does a lot of knowledge work, provides policy support, technical assistance. Typically, as a development bank, there are what we call the statutory windows through which it raises funds to finance all these projects in these sectors I've mentioned, and it also has trust funds and has special funds. All of them, sometimes they mix them, they leverage on one another as a way to deploy more finance for African projects, infrastructure projects. Here, the African Development Bank, and this is not just unique to the African Development Bank, all the multilateral development banks, the World Bank, the Asian Development Bank, the European Investment Bank, Islamic Development Bank, the AFDB, they have climate change departments. So these are cross-cutting departments that work across all the sectors. So at the African Development Bank, we have a climate change and green growth department that is committed to ensuring that every project that the bank finances, it is screened for climate risk. And then when you do that screening, you also inbuild through the screening, we have very specific tools that we use. It identifies certain things that can be strengthened to protect the investment that you're putting in, and also to contribute to building resilience of communities, and overall to contribute to reducing emissions if it's an energy project, if it's an agricultural project, if whatnot. So the broader climate change and green growth vision is to ensure that we build a climate resilient, low carbon, green, inclusive, integrated, and prosperous Africa that is justly transformed for the benefit of Africans. So it looks at adaptation, mitigation, finance, enabling environment. Here we're looking at supporting governments to build policies that are clear in terms of mainstreaming of climate change across all sectors of society. And we have these in the middle orange, you have these special emphasis that are very much integrated into them. So I put this slide we're talking about big numbers, 277 billion a year that is required to implement Africa's NDCs. You might ask, what is the African Development Bank doing in terms of its own contributions? So besides the fact that it's working very steadily and together with the other multilateral development banks, there are methodologies for ensuring that each project that is financed really mainstreams climate change into them. It's also actively mobilizing more resources because of the funding, the degree of funding that's required. So these are maybe two most recent things as a strategic direction for the African Development Bank to pull in more resources to assist African countries address climate change. So we have the climate action window, which it's still being kind of cooked, but the idea of it is that it will be a dedicated instrument to mobilize about 13 billion of finance for adaptation. And the focus is the most vulnerable countries within the continent. Then we also have the Africa Adaptation Acceleration Program. And this program comes from the fact that often it has been communicated by our stakeholders, which are the 54 African countries, that adaptation is the priority simply because we are not the biggest emitters, but we are being impacted, and that should be a focus. So yes, we can help contribute to reducing greenhouse gas emissions, but that should not stop us. That should not be our primary focus. So adaptation is a priority, and so the bank recently launched this Africa Adaptation Acceleration Program with the goal of mobilizing $25 billion, looking at these 4 areas, which are strategic areas for Africa. So agriculture is one, youth, because we have a huge youth population. In fact, the continent is considered the youngest continent globally. And so that program looks at specifically youth that are already starting startups, that are engaged in businesses, that are helping to contribute to enhancing the resilience of communities. And they are provided seed funding of up to $100,000 and support in terms of capacity building to take them from the nascent stage to commercial businesses. So these are I thought you might also want to know more about this. So now I may call it my third baby, because I have 2 other babies, but this is what I do on a regular basis. At the African Development Bank, I manage a multi-donor trust fund, which is a climate fund that provides grant resources to African countries, all 54 countries. The focus is on climate finance readiness, providing small grants to implement small-scale adaptation projects in various sectors, so energy, agriculture, water, and sanitation, some of our key sectors, as well as institutional strengthening when it comes to policy development for climate, and ensuring that at the country level, development and climate change are more intertwined than they are currently. So the beneficiaries of the fund are governments, African governments, so their ministries, departments, agencies are eligible to apply. A big focus for us is also on providing finance for community-based organizations and non-governmental organizations. And these are a very important group because when it comes to adaptation, often the solutions are local. They're very specific to an area. And so if you want to, while you wait, I always say, while you wait for the big funding to come in, and you want to help communities deal with the impacts of climate change now, CBOs, NGOs are your friend. And so we work with them quite closely, both to provide projects, technologies, strategies that help communities to adapt to the impacts of climate change. I'm not going to go through this. In short, I've kind of given you a snapshot of it. So these are the projects that we finance. We have about 26 projects that have been approved. Some of them have ended, but they kind of cuts across the whole continent. We have about eight that are implemented by government ministries, 11 by NGOs, and 2 by UN agencies. And they focus on climate finance, readiness, and small-scale adaptation projects. Oh, sorry, went back. Okay, so I'm going to share in the next few minutes 3 projects. I picked them because I think they give some variety in terms of the types of projects that the Africa Climate Change Fund is financing. So we have this syntrophic agriculture project in Mozambique. In Mozambique, it's a country that has a really long coastline, and by nature of the geography, they are very prone to tropical storms and cyclones, and this is really a real challenge for the area. And as they feel these tropical storms are becoming more regular, and I think one of the pictures I showed was from Mozambique. In 2018 or so, they had like 2 storms back to back, and it really did some very tremendous damage to the area. But nonetheless, this area is an area that is on the coast. The project site is Mokubela district. It's on the coast, and traditionally the community is an agrarian community. A large part of their population is dependent on agriculture. And so this project is looking at very simple agroforestry models where you integrate agricultural crops with timber crops or fruit crops, as well as you build the capacity of farmers to be able to learn these practices and adopt it onto other farms. So through this project, we are enhancing the resilience of communities in this area. They are also able to farm that same land for years because it's able to provide them various crops, unlike before where they do slash and burn, they go here, they exhaust the soils, they go to another place, and that really does a lot of destruction to the environment and the community as a whole. And so through this project, it's also given them some added income. It also, besides the agroforestry component, there's also beekeeping, where we also set up a honey production facility, really a cottage type industry in the community where they process the honey and package it for selling also in the bigger cities and also consuming some. So even their own nutrition is further boosted. And these are very important things that you want to do in enhancing resilience of communities, particularly agrarian communities, to the impacts of climate change. So just a snapshot of some of the results. They start with a demonstration plot. So this is sort of a farmer's school where farmers come, they learn from these plots. Because we have 10 communities in this project, in each community there's one farmer's school or plot, which is the training site, and then they take the training, they apply it. And in there are people from the project team that lives in the community to ensure that the adoption really takes off. We have food processing as part of this, beekeeping. I mentioned the honey house that was established. And one prevalent thing in this community also in the district is that there's massive coastal erosion because they've also cut down, or they are continuously exploiting the mangroves in the area. And so this project also takes a holistic approach or an ecosystem approach by saying that, let's not just focus on the farms, but let's also reforest parts, strategic parts of the landscape. And reforesting the mangroves are also important for when these tropical storms come, because then they don't make landfall quite easily. It's a bit impeded, and that also further protects and enhances the resilience of the community. I put some pictures in there. These are project beneficiaries, and one interesting thing is that, and this is a question we also ask ourselves, are they adopting this? When these projects end, will they continue? How have they shifted from their old practices? And the first quote is really from one of the beneficiaries. She told us point blank, she was used to growing her cassava a certain way, so being convinced to do it another way was quite difficult for her. But when she was able to see the results after a year of, farming the land, they have thought how to space, how to intercrop. She'd never thought that, even though she had farmed her whole life, that you can actually have 5 different varieties of crops on the same land, but it's doable. So it takes time, but a lot of it is also behavioral and attitudinal change that you must be willing as an institution, as a community-based organization, to be there long enough to see these changes happen and to lead to these kinds of results that we want to see. So let me take you from Mozambique in the south to East Africa. And here it's a green energy project for women and youth in Uganda and Kenya. And this project really stems from the fact that from both the peri-urban to rural areas, you have a heavy exploitation of natural resource for, timber or wood fuels for lighting, for cooking and stuff in the households. And so there is a challenge that there are not many energy enterprises, or even access to energy, renewable energy is not that easily accessible. So through this project, there is a link between financial service providers with people in the communities who are trained as energy resellers. And they are in the community, so they ensure that, okay, if you buy a clean cooking or a stove or a solar lantern from me, you will not disappear, because this has also been a challenge. Even though we've seen an uptake of renewable energy, often communities lose interest because they buy the example, they buy a solar lantern one day and it's not working, they don't know where to return it. So making these linkages has been really important. And this is one project we need to do more of them, and also, of course, scale up. So just a few numbers on that. Also, for the resellers who are also trained, they need some capital. And also we need to broker some kind of a trust with the renewable energy companies that are often based in the bigger cities. So this linkage is what the project is focused on, and also providing some capital finance for the resellers to be able to purchase certain numbers of clean cooking stoves or solar lamps, and then to make sure that they are really accessible to those that need them most in their communities. These are some of the partners of the project. Then I want to end with this, because we've been focused on climate finance, and sometimes you ask yourself, what is the role of technical assistance in this? Can you leverage grants to get more access? And this has been really a big focus of the ACCA, because we definitely acknowledge that 25 million is not a lot to go around. And so we use it as a means to leverage more resources for the country. So I'm sharing here examples of projects, several projects which focused on strengthening institutional capacity. And what we mean by this is that we provide grant resources to the countries, the national government. They work with firms that have the ability to develop really good projects to access the Green Climate Fund, the Adaptation Fund, even access AFDB's own internal funds or other bilateral donor funds, and be able to work with them from designing the project with clear climate rationale, climate informed design, which is often what is required for your project to be attractive for financing, and to be able to design it in a very collaborative kind of a learning by doing methodology. And in the end, some of these countries that are listed here have already been able to mobilize money in the millions through the support. And then we also have the second point, there's often a lot of focus at the national level, but as you know, countries have decentralized over the years. You have subnational governments, city councils, you have in our context, we call them districts or sub-districts, and they are also very much implementing projects. They are really driving development in the country, but often they don't have access to climate finance, which is really a big gap. And so our focus is also going towards building subnational government like city councils, districts, regions, providing those government, both government as well as non-government stakeholders there with the tools they need to be able to access also more climate finance. So that at the end of the day, we are not only focused at the national level, but really the impacts of climate change is the most experienced at the community level. So when all these sites are informed, hopefully we'll be able to make a dent and mobilize more resources. Then the last point is also, I don't know if you guys will be familiar, but normally with the multilateral climate funds, you have to be accredited as an institution to apply. So this is another layer of complication that often discourages countries from accessing funding. And so they often go through the UNDPs or the UN agencies and other institutions that have the accreditation to access funding. But now we're turning around and providing support to countries themselves, having built their capacity on the first and second point, to be able to now go to these institutions and submit really sound projects to access funding. So this is an example from Lesotho, a project that we're implementing with the United Nations Capital Development Fund called LOCAL. And through this project, they really work with local governments to show them that even with the resources they have, they can mainstream climate change into them and also provide them some grants to back them up where there are shortfalls. Okay. So just to wrap up, when it comes to finance, it's complicated, but we've made progress somehow. As the map showed, we started from really a low base level to it's increasing, but the scale of the problem requires us to do more and fast to be able to both address the impacts that people, communities are already facing, as well as those that will come later. But we realize that there are differences among countries in their ability to attract international climate finance. And that's something that we are quite keen to. So in our portfolio, we try to, spread out as much as possible to be able to provide support to those that need them the most. We have examples of countries that I would say they become experts at doing that. So for those, we don't provide as much support because we know their capacity has been built very well over time, and then we focus on others. One big challenge in accessing climate funds is that sometimes it's often described that the projects do not have sound climate rationale to back the strategy or the activities that they are looking to deploy. And that is something that needs to be addressed and has been addressed in different forms. Institutions like ours is providing climate data, strengthening regional climate centers to be able to provide that core data that is required for developing these proposals. On my part, as a fund that is providing largely grants, really looking at finding strategic means to leverage what you have, which are the grants, to mobilize more resources. We, of course, from the CPI report, we will need more funding from the private sector. And I'll be real with you, sometimes the private sector do not get what we are saying. So sometimes we need to find, both from the government side, need to have clear policies that says, okay, we are going this way, climate change is important to us, it's part of our development agenda, communicate that clearly, and of course have incentives for private sector to bring in their large funding. Then finally, developed countries need to hold their end of the bargain, and this is just and sound. It's something that we all need to do for our planet. We don't have another planet to live on, and so developed countries, in my opinion, need to hold their end of the bargain to provide the finance that is required for countries to be able to meet their climate goals. And also in doing that, to contribute to cutting back global greenhouse gas emissions and also adapting to the impacts that are already locked in today. So thank you very much for your attention, and I'll hand over to Jeff.
All right, thank you for that great presentation. We have a few minutes for questions for those who are in person and also online.
Thank you for the talk. That's really interesting. I was just wondering, you said in the talk yesterday that you went into a think tank and then in the end went to the African Development Bank. And I was wondering if in the long term you ever see yourself going back into policy, or whether you think you can have the most impact in the bank and why.
That's a very important question. I've actually been asking myself a lot of that recently. And I think I consider myself here in the bank. We have, as I described our work, there's a lot happening all the time. But I consider what I'm doing currently as being able to work, keep my interest in the sense of community development. And I see that very clearly from my work, current role. So maybe not now, but I think it's something I'm considering. And of course, I often do an assessment of my career, where I am, how I'm feeling, what is out there, etc. So it's an ongoing process, but I'm happy that with what I'm doing, at least over the last 4 years, it brings immediate results to me, in my opinion, to people, to our communities that are really being impacted by climate change. And I see it. And so now I'm rewarded, but maybe a few years from now, it'll become boring and I need to find something else to do. But for now, it's fine. Yeah. Do you want us to take a few
Thank you so much for your thank you so much for your talk. Super interesting. I'm wondering what your thoughts might be on what mechanisms does the African Development Bank have to encourage governments to focus on preserving their forests and using their forests as a central part of their climate adaptation and mitigation policies.
Mm. Can we take a few more then?
Hi, thanks so much for your presentation. I was just curious too, you were speaking about, the case studies you gave too, these very local community-based projects for climate resilience, and then also speaking about the potential for industrial agriculture or, gray infrastructure, construction of dams. I'm just curious how, I guess your fund is mostly smaller grants. I think it was up to $1 million, if I remember correctly, but I'm curious how, when you're trying to attract private sector investment, how the African Development Bank communicates these very different kind of climate resilience projects and goals to try to attract investment for these projects?
Okay. Do you want me to? Okay.
Yeah, hi, Rita. My name is Angela. Thank you so much for your presentation. And at the end, I was wondering, you mentioned that we need more funding from the private sector, and oftentimes private sector doesn't understand what you're trying to tell them. And would you be able to elaborate on that? Like, what are some of the concerns, and what are the parts that they don't understand about? Is it like risk or not understanding rationale? Thank you.
Okay. Let me take the 3 questions. No, thank you for that question. And what parts? I think it's often the risk. One of the things that, for sure, I think when it comes to the mitigation part of things, like investing in renewable energy, a lot of the technology now, at least solar, is well proven that the private sector naturally may come to that. But in Africa, there's a huge need in terms of building resilience. And sometimes the metrics for measuring that, it's not well developed or very clear. And so sometimes the risk part for sure is there. Private sector may not be willing to go into technologies or even to adaptation, technologies that are not well known to them, or into adaptation. For sure, adaptation is one clear big area where you don't see private sector engaging in. And so maybe we need to also find strategies where when you're going towards renewable or more defined technologies, to also embed adaptation into that. So that's something that comes with project structuring or project design, to ensure that you achieve both goals. But for sure, there is a lot of sensitization for private sector. At the national level, for instance, you have a lot of commercial banks in our continent, but they provide loans at a very high market rate. And when it comes to this, sometimes you need to we as a bank, or maybe needs to provide them, for instance, as a measure, these are things that the bank is doing, lower interest rate loans for them to on-lend for green projects. And so that is one way we are trying to address that. But then with private sector, naturally, they might not be inclined. I think it's getting better, but we need to definitely find many strategies to try to bring the private sector along, because for sure, we will need the private sector to invest in both mitigation and adaptation, or a large part in adaptation in the continent. But I'll be happy to also have a bilateral with you later also to clarify certain things. How to attract private sector funding into our projects. Okay, so what I spoke about are largely grants projects, and we don't necessarily provide those grants to private sector. However, the African Development Bank, through the projects that it invests in, has private sector playing a key role in that. So you have private sector investing in an renewable energy project. The bank may give guarantees, equities. It might deploy different instruments for private sector to crowd in private sector funding to implement certain projects. But what I was talking about with ACCF, we don't give funding, we don't give grants to private sector. What we are trying to do now, and this is something that could go into next year, is that we are seeing also through discussions we've had with various private sector that wants to access the ACCF, even though we're not giving grants to them, is to see, okay, if private sector wants to access ACCF resources, are they going into a technology that they want to pilot that is not well known, or they want to test out before they commercialize? So we also, as a bank, trying to see, okay, can our trust funds that provides grants maybe on a case-by-case basis work with private sector, where we know that they are also going to bring in more resources after that thing has taken off. So there's also that thinking that is going on to crowd in more private sector to meet the gap that we spoke about. And what mechanisms, the first question was, what mechanisms does the African Development Bank have for countries to preserve forest? The African Development Bank has a trust, it's not a trust fund, it's a fund called the Congo Basin Development Fund. And the focus of that was looking at the Central Africa. So we have like this tropical rainforest there that is known to be one of the biggest sinks for carbon. And so there was a lot, there's still work ongoing, and this fund provides support and resources, particularly for forest protection. The ACCF also does that to a certain extent, as well as other funds that we have. In the bank's own work, we for each project that it finances, it also does an environmental impact assessment. This is required, and where it has to put in infrastructure projects that might go through forest or whatever, it makes sure that it also does some kind of recovery and protects forest in those instances as well. So there are different ways in which we try to integrate forest conservation in the projects that we finance. So.
Thanks, Rita, so much for the talk. So I come from Kenya, and as you mentioned earlier on in your presentation, we're having serious issues with climate change and drought and changing rainfall patterns. But the Kenyan government's response to this has been based around subsidizing fertilizers and encouraging GMO use. So I was wondering what the bank's position is on the use of fertilizers and GMOs in terms of food security. Thanks.
Okay, that's a challenging question. Okay, simple answer. The bank, as I mentioned, screens each project that it implements. Environmental impact assessment is a big part of it. And the standpoint is to protect the environment, to protect the people. And so I will not see the bank maybe investing in GMOs. Of course, there might be agricultural technology. We have a whole technology for agriculture program that we run. But for instance, providing drought-tolerant seeds, etc. But as an institution, we're very cautious or careful of that. So it doesn't answer your question, but as a bank, we are very mindful of that. Yeah.
All right, we have time for one more question. Do we have any questions online? Right.
I'm curious to know what your opinion is on the structure of how this total contribution of finance is calculated, because it's really investment sided, right? So it's not necessarily results focused. And I'm wondering how you can make sure that this co-finance is not focused on things that don't necessarily contribute to climate mitigation or adaptation. And what your opinion also is on using this approach.
Yeah. Okay. No, very good question. And I will encourage you to read the CPI report because it does a good job of also telling the side of it, where it says that these are mostly approved funding, but sometimes when they are being implemented, it's hard to really have the data to say, okay, 10 billion was approved, but actually 10 billion was what trickled down. So it's quite difficult to tell. Maybe there also needs to be a whole studies on looking at project completion reports, because that's where you probably see what happened, the after story, right, of what happened from when they were approved to what actually happened on the ground. But I think it's easy, well, it's not easy, but it's clear to tell because these sectors we are talking about, I mean, it's categorized as climate finance because clearly they are meeting mitigation and adaptation goals of these countries. So from that perspective, it's clear to tell. But certainly this report also mentions that disbursement of funding, sometimes there are such bureaucratic processes that when the project is approved, sometimes it could take 2-3 years before it's implemented. Well, things could have happened in that 2-3 years, and if maybe you do an assessment of that, the value of that contribution you might lose it a bit because it was not deployed early. So on the other side of it, we really need to, not just the African Development Bank, all institutions that are committed to addressing climate change need to deploy the resources quickly. And they need to have very good project designs, because the challenge also with delays in implementation is with the design. So the project might be approved fast, but then when you get to implementation, you realize, oh, we need to go back and look at these things. And that could also be a contributing factor. So really getting clear project designs, like I mentioned, very clear, telling the story very clear. What is the issue? What are you going to do? How will you do it? And how will you measure how you do it? It's very, very important. And that'll be my response to that. But it's work in progress. We don't have it all figured out.
All right. Let's give Rita a hand. Thank you for sharing your time with us. I would also like to give a plug. We also have a double feature this week. So we have a BIOMES tomorrow at 12, featuring a World Fellow. His name is Dr. Zhao Zhang, whose work is in nature conservation and also public participation. So I hope to see you guys here tomorrow at 12.